Good day everyone, Grimmels here with another DCS video. And this is going to be a first part of a series of short tutorial or tips and tricks videos aimed at players new to DCS and flight simulations in general. Now, I recently watched some of Sidestrafe streams as he trains in DCS, and that kind of inspired me to do some tutorials on things that I feel might be hard for players new to full fidelity simulations like DCS, and that are, in my opinion, not well explained in the manuals that come with the planes, or explained in such a way that is more useful for players already experienced with flight simulators, but leaving out some important basics that can give a player new to DCS more trouble than the more complex stuff sometimes. Well, and in this first video I want to take a quick look at landings, specifically the touchdown, the moment where you actually put the plane on the ground, as this is where I think most new players will have a hard time. This is mostly focused on the WW2 tail dragger planes, as they are significantly harder to land properly than most jets. However, some of those lessons should also apply to some of the jets that are known for also being a bit tricky to land, like the MiG-21. Now, I have to say though, don't expect a step-by-step guide on how to fly the perfect approach here. I feel procedures like that, the speed and altitude at which to approach, at what speed to extend flaps and gear and so forth, are usually sufficiently well described in the manual of the plane in question, and there are also already a lot of tutorials out there on that. However, I feel that this is not a difficult part to learn for a new player anyway. It's just about following the data given in the manual. But the difficult part is how to get the plane on the ground safely when you actually reach the runway at the end of your approach and not crash it afterwards. Especially in WW2 tail draggers, that can be frustrating until you get the hang of it. So I want to talk about things that are important for that, like what is a flare and why is it important, what is rate of descent and what are 3-point landings good for in this short video. For experienced pilots that might all be pretty obvious, but new pilots might struggle a lot more than necessary because those things and their importance and employment are often not properly explained. Well then, let's get started by talking about a few things I deem important before we take a closer look at a practical example or two. So again, for the approach to the runway, just use the data from the plane's manual, which should tell you the proper speeds during the approach, what speed to aim for when crossing the runway threshold, when to extend flaps and so forth. That is of course unique to each plane. And as you gain experience, you can modify those standard procedures if you think you get a better way, or a one better suited to your playstyle. And especially in WW2 fighters, most people eventually put their own spin on things. The 3 instruments you want to primarily keep an eye on are of course speed, altitude and rate of descent, also known as vertical speed. This instrument, called variometer or vertical speed indicator, shows your vertical speed, how much altitude you lose or gain per minute or second. On jets, the angle of attack indicator may also play an important role, but not all planes have one. Now, it's this vertical speed or rate of descent that the vertical speed indicator shows you that often gives new players trouble and is often ignored by flight simulator rookies. And they, as a result, for example, fly a perfect by-the-book approach all the way up to the runway, but then don't flare enough or not at all, which leads to hitting the runway at a far too high vertical speed, and they end up breaking the landing gear or worse. So you want to keep an eye on the vertical speed indicator needle during the approach. It will point downwards a decent amount during the approach since you descend towards the runway, but that descent rate is far too high for touching down, so you need to reduce the rate of descent, and that is one reason why you flare before touchdown. So what does flare mean? Well, when you flare, you pull your plane's nose up so that you fly with a higher angle of attack. You have certainly seen planes land in reality, and you probably have noticed that the nose is pointing up when they touch down. That's when they flare. There are 3 main reasons for this. First, it increases the angle of attack of your wings, and therefore your lift, which slows your rate of descent, keeping you from slamming into the ground too hard. Second, it will reduce your speed. And the third, and this one is important for tail draggers like WW2 warbirds in DCS, it will put you in the proper position to do a 3-point landing. Now, a 3-point landing means touching down with all 3 of your wheels at the same time, or as close to it as you can manage. That is important for tail draggers, because if you touch down with the main wheels first, inertia will slam the tail down after touchdown, and that will suddenly increase the angle of attack of your wings, the angle at which the wings move through the air, and as a result increase your lift. With that sudden increase in lift, you will bounce back in the air, and since it will also decrease your speed, you might bounce back in the air a few meters, stall, and come crashing back down on the runway. That's why you want to touch down with all 3 wheels at the same time. Another way to prevent the bounce, though a not very clean one, is to come in at a very high speed at a flat angle. Touch down very light, so that the tail doesn't get pushed down by inertia, and let the plane roll out with the tail up till it stalls. That way it won't be fast enough to bounce back up when the tail comes down. However, there are several problems with that. First, you need a very long runway, which you usually don't have on the Normandy map, and those WW2 tail draggers are very unstable on the ground when rolling out at a high speed, so there's a high chance for an accident like a ground loop. So you usually want to stick with the speeds you get from the manual, which usually mean you touch down just as you stall, about as slow as possible, and therefore need less runway to roll out, and you reduce your chance for an accident as you roll out, since you are quickly slow enough to avoid things like ground loops. Now, another common mistake with the flaring I have seen from beginner pilots is if they flare too soon or at much too high of an altitude. Now, if you fly a standard approach in, say, the Mustang, you will, for example, cross the runway threshold at about 120 to 115 miles per hour. The plane will stop flying at about 90 miles per hour. And as mentioned, the flare will reduce your rate of descent as well as slow you down. So if you flare too soon or at too high of an altitude, you will run out of airspeed at too high of an altitude. The plane will stall and again crash down on the runway at much too high a rate of descent. So you want to make sure that you flare into 3-point landing position only right before the touchdown. Though you can of course adjust your angle of attack and therefore rate of descent slightly during the whole descent to get to where you want to be, but the final flare is right before you touch down. If you are for some reason faster than normal in your final approach, you can of course flare sooner to reduce your speed, but make sure you are low enough to actually land when you get to your stall speed. Now, in jets this is much easier. With their tricycle landing gear you don't need to do a 3-point landing, which means you have more leeway when it comes to the exact angle of attack at touchdown. Those tricycle landing gears are also more stable at high speeds, so you can land at a higher speed safer in a jet than in a WW2 Warbird. All that means you just have more room for error in most jets. Some, like the MiG-21 though, are also not that easy, since the MiG-21 with its high wing loading does not like slow speeds on approach all that much. But the same principles apply. In the MiG you will, if you use the approach as described in the manual, cross the runway threshold at about 320 to 340 km per hour, then again flare to keep the rate of descent in check, and touch down. Well then, with some of those basics explained, let's take a look at a practical example or two. Now, in this case we take the BF-109K4 out for some landing training, using the approach speeds as stated in the manual: 350 km per hour to extend the landing gear, 250 km for the flaps, and then fly the final approach at about 220 km per hour, slowly decreasing speed so that we cross the runway threshold at about 180 kph. Again, as you gain experience you can modify those numbers to suit your needs, but they are a good starting point. And don't be afraid to use the throttle to keep your speed where you want it. At the beginning it will maybe be hard to judge how fast you accelerate or decelerate, so if you get too slow just give it some more power till you're back where you want to be. Now the speed indicator is here and the very important vertical speed indicator here. You can move the gun sight out of the way in the BF-109, but I like having it up, and when it is folded down the vertical speed indicator is harder to see. Now we are a little over 200 kph and descending pretty steep. As I'm about to cross the runway threshold, I start to pull up a bit to slow down to the 180 kph I want over the threshold and start to decrease the rate of descent. Now as I'm about to touch down, I flare properly, slowing the rate of descent to almost nothing right over the runway, while slowing down and getting ready for a 3-point landing, and as my plane slows down enough and therefore loses lift, I drop down on the runway. And we are down. Since we are pretty slow at touchdown, the plane is quickly slow enough to be controllable. If you land too fast in a BF-109, it can be hard to keep it from flipping as you roll out. Now let's take a look at this from the outside where you can see it better. You can see the speed and altitude at the bottom of the screen. Right now we were about 230 kph and we want to be about 220 during the approach and then slowly reduce the speed to get to about 180 kph as we get over the runway. As you can see, our nose is still pointed a little bit down to reduce altitude since we are a little high. This will get us to the runway just fine within the parameters stated in the manual, crossing the threshold roughly 180 kph. But the rate of descent is of course way too high to actually land without exploding at this point. So I level out a bit to at first reduce the rate of descent, and then as we are about above the runway and about to touch down, I flare, get the nose up so that I can touch down with all three wheels at the same time. It's not quite a perfect 3-point in this case, but close enough. Keep in mind that during the approach that when you change your angle of attack to reduce rate of descent, you may have to throttle up at the same time so you don't lose too much speed too fast. Well, and this is it for this little beginner guide or helper, which I hope helps with a few things that the manuals in my opinion don't explain that well, or at least not very beginner friendly. I hope to make more little videos like this if there's interest in it. But till then, I hope it was informative, thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time.